end of the bargain. These provisions are contrary to the spirit of the No Poison Pill Riders Agreement. Thankfully, they are not in the underlying House bill, H.R. 3055, and I expect to have some frank conversations as part of the conference process about the need to remove them and the need to include a number of other important curbs on this administration included in that administration, in that legislation. So I want to be on record that in the conference I will be fighting to keep the House's positions on several of these very important items. I look forward to debating this bill, considering amendments, and ultimately passing it with a bipartisan vote so that we can proceed to a conference with the House. I also want to express my personal thanks to the majority subcommittee staff, Emmy Lasowski, Nona McCoy, Lucas Agnew for working with me and my staff. This is Emmy's first bill serving as the clerk of the subcommittee, and I congratulate her on this milestone as the Senate takes up the bill. Their work is a great credit to Chairman Murkowski and Chairman Shelby. I'd also like to thank my staff, Rachel Taylor, Ryan Hunt, Melissa Zimmerman, Faisal Amin, for all their hard work to accommodate the priorities of senators on both sides of the aisle. And I think that's one thing, Chairman Murkowski, that you and I work on, is trying to handle any request that comes into us for wherever it is in the Senate and deal with it in a bipartisan way. So I very much appreciate working hard with you to get this bill done and to move it on to conference with the House and to get it into law. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to address the Congressional Review Act measure that we'll be voting on later today. Let's be very clear. This is a vote, the purpose of which is to overturn a very, very important part of the tax reform that we passed in December of 2017 that made the tax code much more fair than it was before. And specifically, I'm referring to the limitations that we put on the ability of people to deduct state and local taxes. Let's remember what our tax code looked like before our tax reform. Wealthy individuals could deduct the full amount of any state and local tax deductions, however high they got. And we use the acronym SALT to refer to these state and local tax deductions. So why do I say that that's unfair? Well, it's unfair because it subsidizes people who choose to live in high-tax jurisdictions. It does that because it lowers the tax bill of somebody who lives in a high-tax jurisdiction like Manhattan or San Francisco, because they get to deduct the full amount of the outrageously high state and local taxes that they choose to pay. Now, the fact that they get to deduct that big number means the rest of us have to pay higher rates on our income than we otherwise would have to pay. So why should my constituents in Blair County or Cambria County or anywhere else in Pennsylvania, constituents with modest income who choose local governments that keep modest level of service and therefore a modest level of taxes, why should those constituents have to pay higher tax rates to subsidize the folks who have multi-million-dollar condos on the Upper West Side of Manhattan? It's totally unfair. They certainly should not have to do that. And have no doubt about it, the huge benefits of this unlimited state and local tax deduction that we used to have always flowed to a handful of states which have chosen to have very, very high taxes. California and New York are two good examples. Under the old regime, about a third of all the benefits of the state and local tax deductions went to just those two states. Just California and New York, they had a third of all the benefits. Take New Jersey, right next door to my state of Pennsylvania. New Jersey has 4 million fewer people than we have in Pennsylvania, like almost a third fewer people, but they got more of the benefit of the SALT deductions than my entire state, and that's because New Jersey is a very high tax state. Well, guess what? It's a high tax state because the people who live there voted for politicians that raise their taxes. That's what they want, apparently. They want to have all of the services that go with that. They're happy with very high state income tax and local property tax. That's their decision. Look, if you want to vote for someone that's going to have impose exorbitantly high taxes on you, that you should be free to cast that vote. But don't expect my constituents to subsidize it. So that was the regime we had in place. Tax reform comes along, and we said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to put a limit on the amount of state and local taxes that a tax filer can deduct. The limit's $10,000. It's not trivial. It's a lot of money. But that's the limit. If you pay more than that in state and local taxes, you do not get to deduct it. Well, in response to that, Mr. President, it's very interesting. Several of these high tax states have designed a scam to get around the limitation that we imposed. The scam is they create this vehicle, and then they have their taxpayers pay their taxes into that vehicle and call it a charity, call it a charitable contribution. The money then goes out of that vehicle and goes to the governments. It's not a charitable contribution at all. It's a transparent, obvious attempt to circumvent the law that we passed in 2017. So the IRS came along and said, well, this is an obvious scam. And they developed a rule that shuts down the scam. It says, if you create this scam make-believe charity as a way to circumvent the cap on state and local deductions, we're going to disallow the deduction. So the IRS ruling shuts down the scam, maintains the deduction cap, and what my Democratic colleagues want to do right now is have a vote to invalidate the IRS ruling. In other words, have a vote to keep the scam. That's what the vote is today, to make sure that we destroy the IRS ruling and we keep this scam in place. You know, one of the ironies of this whole debate is our Democratic colleagues voted against our tax reform because they said that it was too much of a tax cut for the rich, despite the fact that, in fact, our tax reform shifted the tax burden from lower income taxpayers to higher income taxpayers while saving money for everybody. The relative proportion of taxes paid increased for wealthy people, decreased for low income people, while everyone had some savings. That was objectionable to my Democratic colleagues, and now they come along and they want to repeal the rule that shuts down the scam. They want to perpetuate the scam that is a massive giveaway to the wealthiest Americans. It's amazing. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, 94% of the benefit, if they had their way and prevailed on this vote, 94% of the benefit would go to people whose income is over $200,000. 52% of the benefit goes to taxpayers with income over $1 million. So not only is it fundamentally unfair to ask people in some low-tax jurisdictions to subsidize the taxes chosen by people in high-tax jurisdiction, the subsidy all flows from low and middle-income people to very, very wealthy people. That's the deal. Millionaires would receive an average tax cut of $60,000. Taxpayers with income between $50,000 and $100,000 would receive an average tax cut of less than $10, not $10,000, $10. $10. So, Mr. President, what we did when we put a limit on the ability to deduct state and local taxes was a big step in making our tax code more fair. These states came along, developed a scam to circumvent it. The IRS quite rightly seized through the scam and said, we're not going to allow that scam to continue. And now my Democratic colleagues want to tear up the IRS rule to perpetuate the scam. That is a very bad idea, and I hope we will all vote against the Congressional Review Act effort that's scheduled for a vote later today. And I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I'm here today because, unfortunately, our elections still remain vulnerable to foreign election interference. Earlier this month, the Senate Intelligence Committee, which I'm proud to serve on with the presiding officer, released its report on Russia's use of social media to undermine our democracy. The committee's bipartisan conclusion was clear. Russia attacked our democracy in 2016, and their efforts on social media are ongoing, and they will be back in 2020. Frankly, they never left. This echoes all the evidence we've seen from the intelligence community, from companies like Facebook, where its CEO was testifying on the other side of the Capitol today, Mr. Zuckerberg, on some of the ongoing efforts. We've seen this evidence as well from Special Counsel Mueller and many, many others. The alarm bells are going off, and what are we doing? We're running out of time to do something about it. Now, twice in recent weeks, I've come to the floor to make a unanimous consent request on bipartisan legislation that I've introduced called the FIRE Act. And twice, this bipartisan legislation has been blocked by my Republican colleagues. Actually, their actions earned applause from the president on Twitter. Now again, let me once again go forward what this bill does. It's pretty simple, very straightforward. It would say to all presidential campaigns going forward, if a foreign power reaches out to your campaign offering assistance or offering dirt on a political opponent, the appropriate response is not to say thank you. The appropriate response is to call the FBI. When I first introduced this legislation, we were concerned with the Mueller's report's finding that the Trump campaign welcomed the assistance of the Russian government during the 2016 election. At the time, I was also deeply alarmed by the president's comments in the Oval Office during the summer that he would entertain offers of foreign assistance in future elections. Now, a lot has happened since then, which makes this legislation more necessary than ever. In the time since I last spoke on the FIRE Act, the president has used his office to seek dirt on a political opponent, Mr. Biden. It appears that he's pressured the Ukrainians. In the middle of ongoing trade negotiations, he went on national television to call on China to investigate Mr. Biden. He also, during this period of time, has used the bully pulpit to intimidate and threaten an intelligence community whistleblower. And I'm glad to see that many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have stood up for the integrity of the whistleblower program and the notion that whistleblowers are a critical part of keeping our system on the up and up, and that whistleblowers should not be threatened. We've also heard that in these past few weeks, and I'm not going to get into all these details, a lot of contradictory and, frankly, almost Orwellian claims about whether the president asking a favor of the Ukrainian president is evidence of a quid pro quo. And then we've seen just in recent days a series of career diplomats coming forward basically trying to validate the whistleblowers' complaints. I know, and the House is working on some of this, and our Senate Intelligence Committee is also looking at some of the counterintelligence concerns about the president's dealings, particularly with Mr. Giuliani and his associates. I have particular interest as well in terms of what the Attorney General is doing when he's going out asking our closest allies, our Five Eyes partners, in the case of Australia and the United Kingdom, to use their intelligence services to bring us dirt on the president's political opponents. That puts in jeopardy the trust basis the Five Eyes plan operates on. So we need more than ever this basic Fire Act bill to make it absolutely clear that if we see foreign governments interfering, the obligation ought to be on any presidential campaign to tell the FBI. Now, I see my colleague on the other side of the aisle, and I know that she will probably object again. I just hope that my colleagues will think about the fact and look back on how history is going to judge this body. Did we do what was necessary to protect the integrity of our democratic process? And how in the heck did we allow the protection of our democratic process to become a partisan issue? We'd never make protection of the power grid a partisan issue. Yet, unfortunately, we're going to see, I think, folks on the other side of the aisle object to this common sense basic requirement. If there are ways to improve on this legislation, I'm wide open. I know my colleague raised concerns about the breadth. Let me be clear, some of the claims that were made last time are not true. Do not affect diplomatic efforts, do not affect folks who are visiting here in this country. We've been very, very clear. This is about a foreign government's offer or their spy services offer of assistance during a presidential campaign directly to that campaign. But if there are ways to improve on the legislation, let's have at it. Let's offer an amendment. Let's at least vote. The truth is, we know what we need to do to protect our elections. And I know I want to simply recognize, before I make my unanimous consent request, recognize my friends and colleagues, Senator Klobuchar and Senator Wyden, who will be speaking on a broader election security bill after I make my request, of which I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor as well. And let me simply say, I support their efforts to make sure that we have that paper ballot backup, to make sure we have post-election audits, to make sure that if the Kremlin is paying for advertising on Facebook, that they have the same kind of disclosure requirements if they advertise on Fox. Common sense, bipartisan proposals that if they actually got to the floor of the Senate, I bet we'd get 80 votes. And my hope would be that we'll have that opportunity. Truth is, the only person that is winning from our failure to act, and unfortunately this person seems to be winning as well in Syria, seems to be winning as well in terms of the split between America and Ukraine, is Vladimir Putin. So again, I appeal to my colleagues, let's move forward on the first step in protecting the integrity of our elections. Let's bring forward the Fire Act. Let's make absolutely clear that if a foreign government tries to intervene in a presidential election, the obligation is to report to the FBI and not say thank you. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Rules Committee to be discharged from further consideration of Senate Bill 2242, the Fire Act. The Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. The bill would be read for a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President, I'm going to allow my colleagues to speak on this item. I would ask my colleague from Tennessee and others, if there are ways to improve this legislation, let's have at it. But the notion that we're going into a presidential election where our intelligence community said Russia and others will be back, that we have taken no action to prevent that, when there are common sense items from social media constraints to making clear that foreign governments shouldn't intervene, to having paper ballot backups, to making sure we have appropriate campaign disclosure We are shirking our responsibility, and I hope in the future my colleagues will reconsider. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I'm proud to be here with Senator Warner and Senator Wyden, both leaders on this election security issue. This is the second time that I have come to the floor this week to urge the Senate to take action on election security legislation. It's been 1,006 days since Russia attacked us in 2016, something that has been confirmed by all of President Trump's top intelligence agents. In fact, former Director Coates actually said they're getting bolder. The next major elections are just 377 days away. We must take action now to secure our elections. And I know that Senator Wyden will be addressing the actual hacking of our election equipment, which is so important, as well as other issues, but I am focused on this propaganda issue.